My name is Anthony Ballard. I'm 23 years old, and I'm from Compton, California, USA. I was living in Compton with my family from 1991, the year I was born, to 2011. With my family and my siblings, we didn't experience like being robbed for our shoes or whatever. Partially because like there's areas of Compton, right? Like, so we grew up on the west side of Compton. From what I know is to be like the more nicer side of Compton. I remember one time I was at a barber shop and a guy asked me like where I lived, and I was like, I live in Compton. And he said, you live in Compton? You don't seem like it. He was like, where are you from? I'm from Compton. I know Compton. And I was like, I live off of Compton Boulevard and Central. And he was like, oh, over there? Oh, that's the west side. That's not that bad. That kind of showed me like, okay, maybe I kind of grew up in a side of Compton that wasn't as crazy as other parts. One time, I was dropping a friend off at home from when we were at school at El Camino. And it was in Compton, same city. And we went further east though. And so we're driving and I'm like looking around, like, man, this is getting bad. It's crazy how the same city, one end you feel okay, maybe because I've grown up there, but then the other side where I dropped him off at, I was nervous. This isn't Grand Theft Auto, you know? I mean, there might be certain areas, but for the most part, no one's waiting there to steal your car the second you pass the Welcome to Compton sign. That type of thing can happen in Palos Verdes or Beverly Hills, you just don't hear about it. On the west side of Compton, not too much crazy stuff happened, but there was a lot of crackheads that would walk up and down the street, or homeless people that weren't necessarily on drugs, they were just homeless. The ones we were became close with, like my family, was a guy named Kiki Boy. He was always walking up and down the street, and he'd always say hi to the family. Kiki Boy would always make sure that the garage was locked, that no one was going to mess with us as we were going inside late at night. My dad actually trusted him to come in the house, like to help my mom. If my mom was bringing groceries, Kiki Boy could help bring the groceries in. And of course, we give him a couple dollars here and there. If you give him money, you didn't feel guilty about giving him money, thinking he was going to go off and do something crazy with it. He just did what he needed to do with it. On our whole block, me and my siblings we were like one of 4 families that actually had our father, present. That's from like the span of 20 years. Having your parents there was something that, we didn't think about, we probably took for granted. But now growing up, I look back and like really think like how sad it is that we were the only ones who had a father in the home. Our parents people respected them a lot, to the point where, adults would call them Miss Rosalind or Mr. Rick. And these are people who were well into their, 30s or even 40s, calling my parents, who weren't much older than them, Mr. and Mrs. or Miss, and that just shows a sign of respect that people had for my mom and dad. And it's because of the way they treated their neighborhood. Even though it was just like a rundown apartment that needed a lot of work, like they still wanted to make sure everything looked nice. For my dad, making me help him clean up the alley. To my mom, wanting to water the plants and having her own plant that she put out there that she wanted to keep looking pretty. They really cared about the neighborhood. They wanted to make sure things were safe. My dad would make me, usually on a Saturday morning, we'd have to go back here and clean up the alley. So we'd take some brooms, whatever we had, to clean up and sweep up the trash back here. This would take, man, like 3 or 4 hours to clean up the whole alley. It sucked, right? But what was I gonna do? He was gonna make me do it. And we sweep up this whole thing from end to end. And all the trash, like, it would be like, broken glass, old TVs, just trash piled up. And so we'd have to sweep it all up into a big pile and try to keep it looking nice. But by the end of it all, everything looked really good. Like, you kind of look back over and like, man, I'm glad we did that, because this all looks great. Dad had so much integrity as far as just being a hard worker and caring about the neighborhood, that even when we swept up all the trash, we wouldn't dump it in other people's dumpsters, we'd only dump it in ours, right? Like, he would make sure, like, oh, only dump it in ours, and it would be like a lot of trash too. He wanted to make sure that if people got mad that there was new trash in there, even though we cleaned up the whole alley for everybody, he only wanted us to dump the trash in our dumpster. It taught really taking care of your environment and where you live, not just your own place, which is just, we didn't just clean up our building, we cleaned up the whole alley. for all, however many of these apartment buildings there is. My mom was a caterer, and so that was her business. One of the things she did was that around Thanksgiving, it was a lot of work. She made full-on Thanksgiving dinners. Like, we made like 50 dinners, like a lot of food too. And then we put them in our trunk and we drove around the city and we just gave them to people who looked hungry. And we did this on a Thanksgiving day. That was a lesson, just how to treat people and how to treat people well. Understanding that there's other people who don't have just the basic things that you have. Even if you do live, you know, in an apartment building, you can still help other people who don't even have that. The interesting thing too about my parents, they both had different upbringings as kids. My dad was crazy poor. He came from a family of 9 siblings and lived in the projects in Virginia. My mom lived in Baldwin Hills area with a dad who was a most successful black car salesman in LA. And then later, when my grandmother started writing hit songs from Motown, she started living in the Hollywood Hills, and Mick Jagger was their neighbor. So my parents had 2 way different upbringings. My dad had ketchup sandwiches, while my mom lived next door to Mick Jagger. Having them as parents with those 2 different upbringings was kind of how we were growing up in Compton. Kind of had a piece of both of their upbringings. Not nearly as bad as my dad, not nearly as great as my mom's, but we still had a piece of both sides, seeing the low and the high. Really, when I was living here, I viewed it as just like a regular place. I didn't know it was like someplace notorious for crime and danger until I started getting older. I remember growing up telling people, they would say, you know, where do you live? I would tell them I live in Compton. They would be like, what, really? Have you ever been shot at? That wasn't my experience at all living here. Like, all I knew was good people, good friends, and one of the best childhoods you can ask for. I guess there is some problems that need to be taken care of here, but ultimately it's gonna have to be the people that want to see their city looking good and that want to see their city be an awesome place. Like, it's the people that make any place great. And I can say that my neighbors in Compton were better neighbors than the neighbors I had when we lived in Redondo Beach. They're better neighbors than I have living in Inglewood. Like, everyone looked out for each other. I mean, you couldn't trust everybody, but for the most part, some of the core people, like, those are the people that looked out for each other. If something was going wrong or something was a little suspicious, like, you know about it because one of your neighbors is going to tell you, like, hey, watch out for this guy. Or somebody was snooping in the back or something like that. So there's like a brotherhood or a camaraderie here that we had here that I really appreciate, you know, now. I know a lot of people who aren't from Compton or who are from pretty well-off places who listen to Kendrick Lamar, and they kind of get an understanding of the city. And that's why I kind of say, like, if my story were to be put on the album, it would be Good Kid, Not So Mad City. Because that's the kind of Compton I knew. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't too mad over here on this side.